So, good morning again. We have a fairly tight time schedule, so I hope you're going to forbear with me. When I moderate, I try to be fairly brisk and assertive in time management, and we have quite a lot to go through. I find this, from the perspective of a long career spent in both development and humanitarian work, a really encouraging development, this conference, because it ties together so many of the challenges that many of us face in our daily work. And I think that the preceding three sessions bring together much of that combined experience. And so I'm really looking forward to this first part, where we ask the moderators of the previous sessions to present key insights and conclusions from each one. So perhaps if I can ask the moderator for the first session to quickly, in 2 or 3 minutes, present the 4 or 5 key points that emerged from that meeting.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. My name is Silvia Morgenroth from the BMZ, which is the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and I was invited to moderate this first round. Now, our question was how we, as international actors and national decision makers, can manage to think longer term in the context of fragility and forced displacement, and how we can connect or even transform temporary social transfers into longer-term social protection programs, and that in the Lebanese context. So the question is very much linked to what you, Alexandra, sketched this morning already. Now, I will give you, 4 conclusions. The first one is that in Lebanon, absolutely considerable efforts are being made to interlink short-term support for the refugees under the Lebanese Crisis Response Plan with national systems, specifically with the NPTP, which is the National Program for Targeting Poverty. There's a high degree of complementarity between these two programs and a very efficient use of the same delivery structures, the social development centers. So the point here is that making use of existing resources and systems is highly efficient. All this has been done with the strong support of international agencies as UNICEF and WFP also. Secondly, an approach is being taken to support both poor Lebanese households and refugees, both Lebanese households and as well refugees. This is extremely important in order to maintain social stability in this situation of protracted crisis. And we came to the conclusion that social stability is definitely an objective in itself, in view also of the specific situation in Lebanon. Thirdly, what were other factors of success and what are other challenges? One overarching success factor is always the context specificity of all measures that are being taken, and the context has changed quite a lot over time since 2011, since Syrian refugees came to Lebanon. And secondly, cross-sector approaches are important factors of success, and also interministerial cooperation, so to assure that health, education, and other issues can be viewed together in an intersectoral way. Another factor of success is overcoming fragmentation. This is of specific concern to the implementing agencies, fragmentations in modes of delivery, for example, or needs assessments. Another factor of success is transparency as to who the funds for social protection are, where the funds to social protection are allocated. Fourth conclusion would be what is our vision? The vision would be the graduation of all population in need, be it Lebanese households, be it refugees, or be it Palestinian refugees. And a further adaptation of different programs and systems with the objective to create systems that are responsive in that way that they can provide support to poor in times of stability and also react flexibly in times of crisis and also of protracted crisis. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Maganon, thank you very much. If I could ask the chair of the second session, the moderator, Mr. Massimo Larosso.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. We quickly go through the main elements, I would say, of the discussion that we had. We had the pleasure to have the representative of the government of Turkey that shared with us their experience on social protection system and going through the different, I would say, mechanisms that are in place nowadays, and how the current support to refugees, supported by the international community, is somehow aligned with the system in place. And the colleagues of WFP help us to see the different main elements, including the delivery system. It's a large electronic payment ongoing for more than 1 million refugees nowadays that are not only Syrians, even if majority are Syrians. And it was, I would say, quite fascinating to see how in this new way of working between humanitarian and development and government institutions, international community, we are trying to avoid to build another parallel system. And then I think with the help of Francesca, we tried to use the example of Turkey to see how this system is potentially replicable, or there are lessons learned that are applicable to other contexts, and which challenges we could face and the risks to move ahead. However, one of, I would say, the key words that has been underlined by many, it was social cohesion. This system in Turkey could be extremely important for other contexts as well, to see how well it could be potentially expanded and to bring social cohesion in other contexts, as is happening there. I would stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Larossa. If I could ask the moderator of the third panel, Andrew Mitchell, to present on the urban challenge.
So I think with the different presentations, we sort of came out with 6 sort of key messages, and there's a range of questions attached to this as well. And I think that the first message coming out is basically the trends in terms of displaced people moving to urban contexts is increasing. Yet, when we look at, say, the coverage of safety nets, there's still a great skewing of people covered in rural contexts compared to urban contexts. And this seems to be across a range of different countries. It's not linked to how rich or how poor a country is. The second thing is that at the moment, methodologies set up for social protection need to be further adapted to the complexities of the urban context. And there are different vulnerability profiles, the homeless, and the definition of where a family lives is very difficult within an apartment block. So where does a family stop and start? The other thing that came out is that there's increasing best practice that's collected, but we still don't have systematic practices and systematic evidence about how we need to adapt. So again, you know, from a numerical point of view, it's really only around a quarter of refugees that live in camps. The rest are in settlements, and around 60% of refugees are finding themselves in the urban context. yet the methodology doesn't reflect this increasing challenge. The fourth message is that we need to look at the type of city, and so Ugo Gentilini was re-emphasising that we need to unbundle city types according to the nature of displacement. So we have cities, large cities with localised displacement impact. We have cities that have a widespread or a great percentage of the population who are displaced. We have cities that still have the impacts of conflict, and we have camps within cities. So we really have to be very aware that according to the type of the city and the nature of displacement and its impact on urban services, that we need to contextualise. There's no one size fits all. The fifth message that was coming out was that really we have to, in terms of adapting the way we do social protection, we have to be aware of how the urban planning and the host government is already dealing with urban contexts in the larger framework. So these aren't two separate systems we're dealing with. Displaced people and host communities live next door to each other. So this has great ramifications in terms of how do we link our interventions in terms of social protection to what the government is actually planning themselves, and having that real linkage at a municipal level rather than a natural social protection system. In terms of scale, I think the Iranian, we had an example from the Iranian context that was really looking at connecting around 1 million people to education and health. In Ecuador, the government has really opened up its legislation to connect people to different parts of the social protection system, and has covered people in terms of natural disasters. And I think the last message coming out very rapidly is we're aiming beyond poverty reduction outcomes. So the example in Ecuador showed that there are sort of peace and gender outcomes that can be attached in terms of social cohesion, in terms of lowering violence on women. So there are additional outcomes that we can be aiming for beyond poverty reduction or humanitarian outcomes. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of the presenters for being commendably brief and concise. I tried to myself very rapidly distill what I think may be some of the themes that connect those three presentations. I will just present a very quick synthesis of that, and then I'll invite and introduce and then invite the panel members up here with me to comment. We often say in UNHCR that big emergencies and crises generate, under pressure, the opportunities for learning and innovation. And I think what we've heard from Lebanon, Turkey, and the urban context very much highlights that. I would say also the challenge that confronts all of us is how to effect an efficient transition from short-term, the immediate imperatives of assisting and alleviating suffering, to longer-term challenges, especially as so many of these contexts, as we know, become protracted. It's important everywhere to take account of context, whether the context is political, economic, national, or, as we've heard, in the context of urban situations, different types of city confronted with different types of social and economic problem. The challenge of crafting to meet those two objectives, linking up the short and the longer term, comes together in crafting a vision of how to do that. And a theme that runs through all of this is how to identify the vulnerabilities within the different populations and adapt our instruments and interventions to meet that challenge. When we look more at the operationalization of this, we reckon that it's extremely important to look at the delivery systems wherever they appear and how we use them and adapt them to obtain the best results. A clear message is, as far as we possibly can, to avoid fragmentation. Fragmentation inevitably occurs when we have parallel systems and governments and states that are challenged And let's not make any mistake about it. Some of these challenges are immense for governments and states to take on in the short term. And of course, just to underline once more, each context is unique, and we have to be flexible and adaptable if we're going to meet this challenge of transitioning from the short term to the longer term. So without any further ado, on the panel here, I think we have 4 colleagues who can speak from different key perspectives. Starting to my left, we have Francesca Bastaglia, who, if I may, represent from the ODI, who represents essentially the research, learning, evidence arm of this panel, and I would like to introduce her in that capacity. Then we have Arthur van Diesen, who I think, working for UNICEF in the Middle East region, straddles, as UNICEF's mandate does, both humanitarian and development perspectives. And so, Arthur, I think I would invite you to speak to some of the points that you've heard from that perspective. To my right, extreme right, Valérie Schmidt from the ILO, who will address these points specifically from the perspective of a development agency. And finally, and last but not least, Emily, who will talk to the humanitarian perspectives from a donor, DFID, what all this challenge will mean, linking it all up. So perhaps I could begin with Valérie, because much of this is about the orientation and transition out of immediate short-term humanitarian to development perspectives. So Valérie, if I could ask you for 5 minutes to present. Thank you.
Thank you. It's our pleasure to be here today with you. As you understand, we come from the development world, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which is supporting the development of sustainable social protection systems in its 187 member states, and based on what we called standards or conventions and recommendations that have been adopted by all the member states at the international level. And these standards that we haven't talked about during this 2 days conference really help to shape the social protection systems based on common values, common principles, such as the right to social protection, which is reaffirmed in these standards, and a number of guiding principles, such as, for instance, the fact that social protection systems should be embedded in law to ensure their long-term sustainability, or that, of course, the financial sustainability has to be taken care of, which is because it's a crucial element of sustainability. And also, there is a very specific part of this type of social protection systems is the fact that they have to be properly governed, but with a clear representation of all the parties involved. So, of course, the government, but also representatives of the people who contribute to these social protection systems and who benefit from them. So this is a very short introduction to tell you where we come from. And what is interesting with all these debates on the transition from short-term to long-term perspective in terms of the development of social protection systems and this humanitarian and development nexus is that we have a role to play as part of this community that comes more from the humanitarian side. And the best, I think, illustration of this need to link our efforts and work together is the recent memorandum of understanding that we have signed between the ILO and UNHCR. So if you look at ILO and UNHCR, these are 2 completely different animals. One of them is working really in the humanitarian side, and the other one is in the long-term development of social security systems. And the idea of this combination, this alliance, this partnership is really to work on this nexus, on the transition from short-term to longer-term perspective, and to put all our complementary skills and approaches so that we can work on that. I would like to stress a few things that have not been mentioned during the conference, not so much. A lot of interventions were around graduation, how to ensure that people who receive like short-term benefits and so that they can, to alleviate suffering, as you just said, can progressively become less dependent from this support. At the ILO, we promote, of course, the right to work. And right to work, it means that the refugees or the displaced populations at some point may be able to take on a job and become, of course, independent, autonomous, and also progressively contribute to society as a whole, and in particular to social security systems. And I understand from the intervention of Uganda yesterday that this progressive integration in society is taking place, and that the refugees have already the right to work in Uganda. They have also already distributed 120,000 work permits in 2016, and that progressively they will also be able to contribute to the contributory social security system, which means that they will be less dependent on non-contributory cash transfers and other type of assistance. So I think that this is more or less what I wanted to say, and I can go in more specific details if you are interested by this ILO and UNHCR MOU. Thank you.
Valerie, thank you so much. Perhaps I can now turn to Emily Henderson, who will give her perspectives from a donor and particularly focused on the humanitarian challenges.
Thank you very much. So as many of us donors, we cover humanitarian and development. Some of us are not divided, but I'm going to focus on the humanitarian side, which is where I work personally. And I wanted to reflect a bit on what are the implications or what is the learning from the social protection work that you have been sharing here for the way we design and fund humanitarian cash, for the way we think about it today. And I think there was a reference in the session I attended about perfect is the enemy of the good, right? So it's not all or nothing. It's not either the social protection stamped, as Stefan was saying yesterday, the perfect one, or nothing at all. And it's also not necessarily also alignment or piggybacking, but what about those places where there is no system, where one can think about alignment or piggybacking or integration? What is it that we as humanitarian people who use cash as one of the instruments, what is it that we can absorb and learn from your social protection, from the social protection work, our social protection work? I think, and also I want to reflect on the thinking about transition from short-term to long-term thinking. I think the context we have been talking about have challenged us on the short-term and long-term concepts. We are in places with long-term issues where we use humanitarian tools sometimes because of circumstance, most of the times because there is an element of life-saving to it. So I just want to reflect on how is it really a transition, or should we be thinking about what is it that we can learn from the long-term approaches in places where we have short-term, what is called short-term tools? Though I think we could challenge that. Humanitarian doesn't need to be short-term tools. So we learned about the planning and the approaches. So we heard about interlinking planning and having coherence between national plans and humanitarian response plans. We talked about using instruments that exist in country or using plans existing from the countries. We also talked about thinking not only about the refugees or the displaced or the humanitarian caseload, but the hosting communities. I think what is very important for us is not only that integration or cross-sectoral, as we say, across national and development or humanitarian actors, is reflecting within our humanitarian sector itself. Cash is an opportunity, has brought us to new territories where we have to think across agency mandates, status, right? From status to vulnerability or to other forms of categorization. It's really pushing us to think about people can use cash as they want, right? Food security, wash, water, shelter. It's forcing us to think, how can we work together in a way where coordination is not only informing each other or aggregating what we do, but is making those plans coherent. So I think we can learn from that very strongly in streamlining. I heard also in the session where I was, where we have to put the bar higher. So what is it that the humanitarian cash transfer can bring to social protection systems? I think what is it that humanitarian cash transfers can bring to the humanitarian system itself? What is it that we can learn there so that it's not too late? It's not 6, 7, 10 years into the crisis that we are thinking, how is it that we are going to bring it all together? Basically, all the different cash transfers, one for a purpose, another one for another purpose. How is it that from the beginning, when it's not too late, or even from preparedness, we can think about single transfers as part of a broader response, much more cross-sectoral response? So I guess the question for us is, how would a humanitarian response in the context of long-term issues look differently if we integrate the learning from here? Practical opportunities that I can see, or pragmatic opportunities. The Grand Bargain has committed to increase, the signatories of the Grand Bargain is one opportunity, not the only one, have agreed to increase the use of cash. And actually there is a reference to social protection. There are work streams where this is being discussed. Work streams on the humanitarian development nexus, where we can bring the learning from here. Work stream on cash that we co-lead with WFP, and we are very interested, both co-conveners, very interested in bringing the learning from social protection. There is a work stream on needs assessment. Needs assessment is where everything gets defined. Who, what, and how do we bring all these elements together? So I would highly encourage to link with that. Other points, donor coordination. We are part of the fragmentation, right? Or we are a solution, we can contribute to reducing the fragmentation. The good humanitarian donorship, so a broader group of donors, is working as well, reflecting on cash. And this is a place where we are very interested in thinking on how greater coherence among donors can support humanitarian aid and beyond. I want to refer as well to Iraq, where a group of donors came together to reflect on how humanitarian cash could look differently, or what is it that we could improve and be more coherent on, and this is something started soon. So these are opportunities that I see. Lastly, on funding. Yesterday there was reference of the fact that working more along the lines of a long-term model leverages development funding. That's not the only reason. It's not humanitarians trying to kind of bring the funding. Is also what is it that we can learn in terms of costs and benefits, value for money of more social protection type models that we could use today in humanitarian programming and humanitarian cash. And this is the evidence that I'm looking for. So I'm very open to it. Yeah, this is what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much. Before we go to the next two panels, I understand that there are small pieces of paper being circulated, so as we can maximize the use of our time, if the colleagues could start collecting questions, then we can move to the plenary discussion as soon as possible. Okay, Arthur, we will hear from how the development humanitarian nexus looks from your perspective on social protection.
Thank you very much, Ewan. In fact, Emily and myself didn't coordinate before our interventions, but actually we're speaking about very similar issues, because like her, I would also like to talk practicalities about how we actually strengthen the collaboration between our humanitarian work and our systems development work. So that they actually no longer are two sides of this, no longer two separate streams, but actually two sides of the same coin. So I'm very encouraged with the consensus that's emerging from this conference, which is all about the need for systems development, the need for a longer-term perspective in everything we do. So really, if we start picturing that ideal situation we would like to see eventually, it is very much around when a disaster strikes, we have a shock responsive system in place, and whatever humanitarian response needs to be rolled out can be rolled out through that national system, and our problem is solved, essentially, right? Or at least, if the government system isn't ready to provide that response, we have a very good understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of that system, and as humanitarian and development actors, we come together and we provide humanitarian support in a way that actually contributes to system survival and system strengthening in the long term. But the reality, we know, is often quite different. It's usually very different. So a disaster strikes, and actually the system is not shock responsive. And even many of us lack the evidence that we would need to make any kind of judgment on strengths and weaknesses and the ability of the system to respond. So how are we going to act in those circumstances, and how can we improve that? I think there are actually some nuts and bolts issues in the humanitarian architecture and in the way we coordinate humanitarian responses that also need addressing. So what typically happens is that in most countries where we work on social protection system strengthening, we have a development partner group that coordinates across the development partners how best to support government in these efforts. When a humanitarian response starts up, often the development partner group on social protection ceases to meet because their work is interrupted somehow, and then you have a cash assistance or a cash and markets working group that starts up, and typically that looks only at humanitarian cash. So that's part of the issue we need to resolve, right? So we really need to start creating donor platforms that start looking across this humanitarian development divide, and that start looking beyond cash per se, that actually start looking at the social protection response in a humanitarian situation. Otherwise, we're not going to address these issues. Similarly, Emily already referred to some of the needs assessments. At the moment, I mean, of course, in the sectors where we've been providing a humanitarian response for a very long time, health, education, WASH, we have very well established assessment tools. For social protection, I haven't seen such a tool yet. Yes, there are cash and market assessments that will help you decide if and when and how to roll out the humanitarian cash transfer. But are there assessments that really comprehensively look at social protection? I hope there are somewhere out there, but I haven't seen them if they're there. If they're not there, we need to start developing them. Similarly, in terms of the humanitarian architecture around the topic we're discussing, social protection as a response to humanitarian needs, the cluster system hasn't kicked in for this type of issue. So we have clusters on WASH, on education. We know who is in the lead. We know how, with their internationally agreed standards for all these groups, where is social protection in that architecture. So if we're serious about putting the good ideas we have here together into practice, I think these nuts and bolts issues on the humanitarian side need to be addressed. That's one point. Do I have time for another point?
Please, it's such a good one. I think we're all keen to hear more.
So the second point is a bit of a sensitive one. So I'm going to drop a little bit of a bombshell here. And it is around why would donors actually invest in this type of social protection response? And I think we've all been, many of us have been in the situation where essentially the dialogue that we have with bilateral donors, with multilateral donors, sometimes with individual donors, is around, okay, can we, if we give you money for social protection, can we actually stop this migration flow? It's not an uncommon argument and not an uncommon motivation to hear when we talk about our investment. Now, the answer, I think, needs to be a resounding no. Because it's a bit of an illusion to think that the social protection that we provide through our humanitarian responses is actually going to significantly implement the decision people make to migrate or not. Mainly because the people who ultimately are able to migrate actually need some resources to do that. There's an equity issue around migration. The people who make that terrifying, difficult journey across the Mediterranean actually need to have some resources to even start that journey. The people we address in our social protection response are very much the poorest and the most vulnerable who are not even able to initiate that journey. So then to think that the social protection response we provide is going to stop migration, even if we think that we should be in that business, it's an illusion. Now, but there is a very strong investment case for social protection. It's a much longer-term gain. It's a much more longer-term agenda around building social cohesion and bringing stability and prosperity in the countries of origin. So I think we need to be very clear on that narrative. We haven't discussed that particular point, but I think it needs to be an element of our discussion going forward. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Artur, thank you. Francesca.
Thank you. So I'm going to approach this from a sort of researcher angle, and I'm a researcher in social protection and social policy, so I'm taking that approach. Just to start, as a researcher does, I think there is a point to be made about the objectives, so clarifying objectives and principles that underlie the social protection and humanitarian actions. And I think that there are areas of overlap, but also differences here that to which some of the underlying questions can be traced. And in particular, I just want to reemphasize something that was said yesterday in the opening session, that social protection pursues poverty reduction, poverty relief, and assistance to vulnerable and marginalized groups as one of its objectives, but pursues other important objectives, including risk pooling, the income consumption smoothing over the course of people's lifetimes, redistribution. So there's this life cycle element to social protection, which has huge implications for how we think about and talk about extending social protection to forced displaced persons. And in particular, means we need to think about the length of displacement, issues of the principles of repatriation or resettlement or integration in a country. As far as research is concerned, I think that, yes, we've said already that there's a lot of new work that needs to be done in examining what is just happening now. So these initiatives that we're seeing that help these new links or increased coordination and alignment between humanitarian and social protection efforts. However, there's a bulk of existing analysis and research that touches upon some of the issues we are grappling with that I think can yield important lesson learning. One of the areas where research can contribute important information is around the design and implementation of shock-sensitive or shock-responsive social protection. We've said that much of this work focuses on shocks other than the ones, or crises that are different to the ones we're talking about now. So in particular, look at sort of climate-related, extreme weather event-related shocks, or shocks in the context of financial and economic crises. But some of the lessons that emerge from that literature, for instance, around how to design and implement a targeting system that facilitates scale up or adjustment in the event of a shock, the use of information systems and management systems that facilitate scale up, the inclusion of contingency financing mechanisms, all of these aspects that are dealt with in this literature do yield already important information and lessons that could be extrapolated to this the question of extending social protection to forced displaced populations. It's also true to say, though, I think that as this work proceeds, there's much more we can be doing around analyzing the institutional arrangements and practices that facilitate effective response in the extension of social protection to forced displaced groups. A second area where there's extensive evidence is around the impacts of social protection on people's well-being, and for this we know there's like I say, a strong body of evidence of impact on national, so local populations, but also increasingly growing numbers of studies that look at the impacts of social protection or humanitarian type interventions on refugee well-being and outcomes. And this literature tells us a lot about, of course, what are the design and implementation features that permit and facilitate impact in the direction we intend, and tells us just how powerful social protection can be. So we have, again, there's a strong body of evidence on how variations in the level of a transfer or in the targeting approach used, if we're talking about cash transfers, of course, but also in the frequency of a payment or duration of participation in a program, how all of this matters to people's outcomes. There's plenty of evidence on that. There's also evidence around the potential for social protection to promote social cohesion. This has come up among other speakers now as well. And for the role that social protection plays, particularly when we talk about it in its broader sense and in relation to taxation and to the financing models for social protection, the issue of the potential for this to strengthen virtuous processes of accountability, improvements in service delivery, increases in the willingness to pay taxes, and the potential for strengthening social contracts. On the other hand, this body of work also examines the potential unintended effects of social protection. And this is something, again, that hasn't quite come up here, but where in certain examples or cases that we have talked about, we do need to, as analysts, pay attention to potential unintended effects, including, for instance, in terms of social cohesion. Yes, social protection could promote and has potential for promoting that sort of result. It can, we know, also exacerbate or aggravate social tensions or sense of resentment where there are perceptions of unfair treatment, or indeed there are differential treatments that aren't justifiable from an equity perspective. So this points to the importance of, yes, increased coordination between humanitarian and domestic national policy, but also that we pay particular attention to principles of fairness and equity, for instance, between the treatment of refugee populations and the host communities. Another area of work that is relevant to the question of extending social protection to forced displaced groups is that on migrant workers. So it's slightly, the focus is slightly shift, but still this is relevant, I think, to this topic and concerns identifying the barriers to take up and participation in social protection by migrant workers. And again, some of the issues that have been examined over time and what are the ways forward in terms of tackling these concerns yield some important lessons. And finally, I just want to touch upon the literature that looks at the question of whether migrants, the integration of migrants in labor markets and social protection system. The two things are obviously linked for the reasons we've said. And so what can be done to promote this sort of integration? What are the risks of discrimination, labor market discrimination against migrant workers? But also questions around whether migrants are a burden or not to public finances of a country. And in particular here, I can think of studies for high-income countries that point to how migrant households on the whole are net contributors to the fiscal system and contribute more than what they're actually benefiting from. I think that this sort of evidence is compelling and can help to inform policy decisions in terms of specific program design, but also in terms of system building as we move forward. This morning we saw a video that listed myths around cash transfers and looked at how evidence can be used to dispel these myths. I think that research has a valuable role to play in relation to cash transfers, but also to migration, forced displacement, where there are myths, where there are preconceptions and prejudices. We need to use the evidence to inform these issues as well.
Thank you very much, Francesco. I'm sure we all agree there's a good spread of expertise up here to respond to many of the questions that are coming in. I realize that under the pressure of time, we probably won't have opportunity to respond to them all. So you'll allow me perhaps the moderator's choice of which ones to ask. There'll be a rapid selection process. Perhaps there is a question here for Valérie, who spoke of issues around the right to work and its links with social protection. And the question is, how can that issue, the right to work for forcibly displaced people, not turn into labor exploitation? How could that be minimized? So if I could put that to Valérie to kick off.
So to avoid labor exploitation, there are laws, and as soon as the right to work is recognized, it means that the labor law or the labor code should apply. And usually this labor law emphasizes or promotes what we call at the ILO decent work, which includes offering to people opportunities for jobs that provide a fair income. It means also ensuring that people who are working can also have safe working conditions and can contribute to social protection for themselves, so that they can be protected in cases of unemployment, in cases of health, ill health, and other risks that are related to work or not related to work. The third aspect is that they can have also prospects for the development of their own careers by having access to skills development, for instance. And the fourth aspect is that they have freedom of association, meaning that they can really express their concerns in an organized manner. So by promoting decent work through labor law and ensuring that this would, of course, reduce the risks of labor exploitation. Thank you.
I can say that there are rather a lot of questions around that issue. So I think that Valérie's response may have provided an answer to some, but not all, but we may come back to that if time allows. Just to move things along, a question perhaps for Emily here. How does the value for money imperative change if additional outcomes for humanitarian cash and social protection are included? And the questioner is thinking here of issues like what are the protection outcomes, what are the results for peace and social cohesion, resilience, risk management, and indeed, as Arthur raised, stabilizing migration movements. There's a nice basket of issues there for Emily to respond to.
So I will start by saying that cash is always part of a holistic response, a humanitarian response. And therefore, I think what cash and actually social protection learning can help us do is not only look at a program or a project as we see them in humanitarian, but as a whole humanitarian response. So basically, the outcomes do not change. A humanitarian response has protection outcomes, might have water and sanitation outcomes, might have food security outcomes. And what cash is helping us to do is, instead of looking at the value for money of one program that might aim at protection or one program that might aim at something else, is think about the value for money, and this is cost efficiency but also cost effectiveness of the whole response. So I would say we are not asking cash to address, we are not loading more outcomes, we are just looking at the whole response and the different outcomes that anyway that response and that sector, that humanitarian plan was aiming at looking at. What we are thinking about is how can we do a better use of resources. And I think one element that I would be very interested to work on is how the way social protection actors measure outcomes in a much more a broader range of outcomes at once, how is it that we can learn in humanitarian about that, and also to have the same language in terms of outcome measurement and value for money metrics? So I hope I'm just, in a nutshell, it's the same outcomes.
Thank you. A question for Arthur, and it speaks a little bit to the issues that he raised in his own presentation, so I hope there's no collaboration going on between the... but the question is a good one, I think. Do we need another tool for assessing social protection, or do we need to look at existing tools and adapt them? And I assume that the question is referring specifically to market assessments, needs assessments, response options. And can we, and I guess this is partly must be from somebody in the UN system, it says, can we refrain from generating more tools? And can we design these tools collaboratively so that we don't multiply similar tools by different organizations? Arthur.
Great, thank you very much for that. I think there's definitely a lot of work we can build on. If you look at the development side, as development agencies, we've done a lot of work together to develop these interagency social protection assessment tools, that whole basket of tools. Maybe that's one starting point to start looking at the shock responsiveness of systems. To an extent, it may already be there, but we can build that out further. Similarly, from the humanitarian side, I think before jumping into a completely new tool that isn't linked to any others, let's look at the existing tools. But I think many of the tools that are there, I mean, particularly looking at cash and markets, I think are a little too narrow in scope. They gather very useful evidence to structure a social protection response, but they're not the whole thing, because they don't look, for example, at to what extent the different elements of a social protection system are still in operation. So is the payment mechanism that, I mean, if a social protection system uses a post office, to what extent is the post office still functioning? These kinds of issues might not necessarily be addressed in a narrow tool. So I think definitely we need to start from a good assessment of what is there already and then build on that. There was another question that you passed to me, which is around, what are the next steps really? Do we need to change the humanitarian architecture by necessarily creating a new body? I mean, a new body is the last thing I would argue for. I think there's enough bodies in the room here already. The issue, though, is that there is another suggestion here that we might need a groupe de sages, a group of wise women and men who think about this. I think that would actually be a very useful starting point, as long as we qualify wisdom as people who both have boots on the ground experience and an understanding of the global humanitarian architecture. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've been trying to select through the questions here in a balanced way between the substance of the three presentations earlier and the constituencies represented on the podium here. So I'm going to direct this question, it's a little bit of an ambush to Francesca, but being that she represents the research constituency, she'll forgive me, I hope. The question is, and it relates to the urban challenge, the question is the increase in urban social protection a function of increased needs, a changed political landscape, or improved technology? So perhaps I can give Francesca a minute or so to reflect on that, or you
needs, changed political landscape,
or improved technology.
It will likely be it will likely be a combination of these factors, and again, we see different things happening in different places, so it's hard to make a sort of generic comment, I think, or conclusion about the determinants of what's driving expansion of social protection in urban contexts. It's probably a combination of all these things. The political interest in expanding coverage to areas that are undercovered, particularly where we have high urbanization rates or movement of people from rural to urban sectors will be in part a result of the pressure, possibly public pressure and needs. So that's already, there's a link there between the two. And advances advances in the use of technology to deliver social protection in urban contexts simply facilitates that actually happens. So again, I don't know if it's necessarily a determinant, but certainly allows it to happen.
Thank you. I'm going to throw out a question for any of the panel members to respond to. The drafter of this question says, we've heard a lot about how social protection can be a powerful policy instrument to address situations of forced displacement, but few commentary or less insights on the role or potential for social protection in context of ongoing conflicts or intercommunal violence. Are there any reflections from any of the panel members on how social protection might be mobilized in these rather more challenging contexts of ongoing violence? Artur?
Yeah, maybe I can reflect very briefly on our experience in Yemen, where we're rolling out quite a large-scale emergency cash transfer project. What we're learning from the current project and from previous efforts in that direction is that, yes, this is possible. Obviously, one precondition is that markets are functioning one way or another and that cash actually buys people something. But you need to work differently. So there are lots more, obviously the risks are much higher, so your risk mitigation measures need to be different and more intense. So we all work with third-party monitoring. There's even the element of fourth-party monitoring that we're looking at there, where you actually monitor the third-party monitoring. There's obviously a lot of additional efforts around facilitation in terms of entering disputed areas, areas where there is active conflict. How do you actually enter these areas? What kind of expertise you need in order to facilitate that access? So yes, it can be done. It is being done, but it requires a different way of working.
I think I would like to go back to the idea of the right. If the right to social protection is recognized by law, of course, during the conflict, people who are entitled to this right should be able to exercise the right. And of course, it's, as you said, it's sometimes very difficult for practical reasons. But we should not keep. We should keep this idea of the right and the capacity to exercise the right, because we can see, for instance, in Ukraine, where in the conflict-affected areas, people who have contributed during years to get an old age pension, they claim that they have this right to receive the old age pension. The only problem, of course, is that they have to cross the border to get it. So I think we should keep this idea of a right to social protection and not consider social protection as a handout, because if you consider social protection as a handout, when a difficulty arises, like a major conflict, this social protection will, of course, disappear.
Emily?
Yeah, so just very quick thoughts. I mean, there are contexts where there will be no existing social protection system, like in Yemen, where there was a possibility to build, or countries where thinking about nascent safety nets might be an aspiration, but might be complex. So for me, the thinking is, what is it in the way we deliver humanitarian aid today that can start absorbing learning and good ways of working coming from the social protection, in particular the multi-year, and not only the multi-year funding, but the multi-year planning and multi-year delivery. I know this is a difficult topic because, especially and coming from a donor perspective, we know what it is to get funding for this kind of emergencies, and it works better when it's an emergency alert than a very multi-year. But how do we do that? And also in the ways we do it in the field, how do we all pass on multi-year funding, for example, because that's one of the issues that we have. That's only one of the operational elements, but how do we make sure that people on the ground and national NGOs and national actors can have access as well to this kind of approaches? for a quick one.
Thank you. Since we've arrived at 1:45, I'm looking around the room and not seeing a food security revolution on my hands at this point. Perhaps time for one more question, simply because it's been sent to us in French. So I'll do a very quick translation, and then I think we can stop. The question really is, we are faced inevitably in these contexts with making difficult decisions because of a limit of resources that are available. So what is the best way of ensuring good social protection outcomes when we have limited resources at our disposal? Perhaps, Arthur, I could put that question to you.
Yeah, that's quite a difficult question. I think one key, I'll offer one answer, and then others can come in with other thoughts. One, I think, is to be realistic and modest in terms of the programs you roll out and the levels at which benefits are set, because I think worse than low benefits are actually unpredictable benefits. We have some evidence from, we have some colleagues from Jordan in the room, where we were implementing a child grant for Syrian refugees. One of the messages we get from the post-distribution monitoring around that child grant is what makes the most difference is actually the predictability. Yes, the grant is useful in terms of avoiding negative coping mechanisms, but if only we knew that we could depend on this grant for a very long time, regularly, at set dates, at every single month, the impact would be so much greater. So I guess one message is be modest and realistic in the way you design your benefit, so that subsequent funding difficulties aren't going to then need to lead you to suddenly discontinuing the grant, for example.
Valerie?
On this idea of limited resources, there is, it's again going back to the right. Since 2012, there is what we call the idea of the social protection floor. And it's not only an idea, it's the reaffirmation of the right to social protection. And it was adopted in the form of a recommendation by the International Labour Conference by all ILO member states, so 187 countries, including the business associations and the trade unions. Why I'm talking about that? It's because it's the very basic level of or type of social protection guarantees that everybody should by right enjoy. It includes access to health care. It includes income security across the life cycle, meaning that children should get access to education and nutrition through transfers in cash or in kind. The working age should be protected when they are sick, unemployed, etc. And the older person should have access to basic old age pensions. What we see after a few years of implementation of this social protection floor is that over 30 countries in developing countries, not middle income and high level income, have already achieved at least one pillar of the social protection floor. It can be universal health coverage, it can be old age pensions for everybody, it can be child grants, etc. So, of course, they don't start with very high levels of protection. They start with very low level of protections because, of course, high level of protections are not affordable, and that you need progressively to build the fiscal space to ensure access to social protection for all. But at least they start. They start with at least one guarantee. We can see that so many examples, and all are available. And we have launched a universal social protection initiative with the World Bank, with many UN agencies and bilateral cooperation and governments to really keep track of this expansion and to support it, because we believe that if you start with at least one guarantee and expand it to everybody, progressively you can build more sustainable and more adequate social protection system.
Okay, so let me try and very, very rapidly conclude. The point of the session was to try and tease out some of the key insights evidence, learning from different experiences in the sessions. The second objective was to try and identify some practical ways forward in meeting the challenges of bringing the social protection space into this discussion on the humanitarian and development cooperation. And the third was to agree and identify really what are the key challenges and how do we take those forward. And I think you'll all agree with me that largely those objectives have been well met in this discussion. So it leaves me really only to thank the four panelists, and I think everybody will join me in giving them a strong round of applause. Thank you.